The bulldozer's engine roared to life, its steel blade gleaming in the morning sun as it rolled toward the century-old barn where Sarah's horses whinnied in terror. Margaret Whitfield stood behind the machine, her perfectly manicured finger pointing at the structure like a death sentence. "Tear it down," she commanded, her voice cutting through the air like ice. But as the blade touched weathered wood, Sarah emerged from the shadows holding a single piece of paper, one that would turn Margaret's world upside down and expose the devastating secret she'd killed to keep buried. The first thing Sarah Chen noticed when she stepped out of her farmhouse that Tuesday morning was the silence. No gentle lowing from the pasture, no soft nickering from the stable, just an unnatural quiet that made the hair on her arms stand up. She'd been caring for rescued animals on her 40-acre property for 3 years now, and the morning symphony of her charges was as reliable as sunrise. She hurried toward the barn, her boots squelching in the morning dew, coffee mug forgotten on the porch railing. The massive structure loomed ahead, its weathered red paint and silver tin roof a testament to the century it had weathered. Her grandfather had built this barn with his own hands in 1924, and it had sheltered everything from dairy cows to her childhood dreams of becoming a veterinarian. "Buttercup Charlie," she called, using the sweet voice that usually brought her horses running. Nothing. Sarah rounded the corner of the barn and stopped dead. Her mouth fell open, and the blood drained from her face. There, positioned like sentries around her property's perimeter, stood a small army of contractors, surveyors, and equipment operators. A massive yellow bulldozer sat idling near her fence line, its blade angled toward her barn like a weapon. At the center of it all stood Margaret Whitfield. Even at 7 in the morning, Margaret looked like she'd stepped out of a country club magazine. Her silver hair was pulled into a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place. Her cream-colored blazer was pristine, her pearl necklace catching the light. She held a leather portfolio in one hand and a cell phone in the other, barking orders with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Mrs. Whitfield," Sarah's voice cracked as she approached. "What's going on here?" Margaret turned, her cold blue eyes sweeping over Sarah with undisguised disdain. She took in Sarah's faded jeans, mud-stained boots, and the flannel shirt she'd thrown on without buttoning properly. "Miss Chen, how fortuitous. I was just about to have someone notify you." "Notify me of what?" Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. Margaret opened her portfolio with theatrical precision and withdrew a thick stack of papers. "The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association has voted to exercise our authority under Section 4.7 of the Community Covenants. This structure," she gestured dismissively at the barn, "is in violation of multiple architectural guidelines and poses a significant health hazard to the community." Sarah stared at the papers Margaret thrust toward her, the words swimming on the page. "Health hazard. This is a working farm. We've been here since before your development even existed." "Not anymore." Margaret's smile was raised. "As of 6 months ago, when the county rezoned this area for residential use exclusively, your little menagerie became illegal. The barn must be demolished within 72 hours, and all livestock must be removed from the premises." 72 hours. Sarah's voice rose to a near shout. "You can't be serious. I have 12 horses, 6 cows, and God knows how many other animals that depend on this place. Most of them are rescues, they can't just be moved." "That's not my concern." Margaret's tone was arctic. "What is my concern is the property values in Willowbrook Estates. Do you have any idea what your little petting zoo is doing to our investment? The smell alone has driven away 3 potential buyers in the Hendersons' neighborhood." Sarah felt her world tilting. She grabbed the fence post to steady herself. "The Hendersons live 2 miles away. There's no way they can smell anything from here." Nevertheless, Margaret closed her portfolio with a sharp snap. "The association has spoken. You have until Friday morning to comply, or we'll do it for you." She nodded toward the bulldozer operator, who revved the engine in response. "You can't just destroy someone's property." Sarah's hands shook as she clutched the papers. "This is America, not some dictatorship." Margaret stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could smell her expensive perfume. When she spoke, her voice dropped to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than shouting. "Miss Chen, let me explain something to you. I've been the president of this HOA for 8 years. In that time, I've successfully fought off 3 different attempts to build low-income housing in our area, prevented the construction of a gas station that would have brought undesirable elements to our community, and maintained property values that have increased by over 40%. I don't lose battles, especially not to someone like you. Someone like me." Sarah's fear was rapidly being replaced by anger. "Someone who clearly doesn't understand how civilized communities work." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Someone who thinks she can just do whatever she wants without considering the impact on her neighbors? Someone who needs to learn her place?" The racist undertone hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory the stories of being turned away from restaurants, of having rocks thrown at their windows, of having to work twice as hard for half the recognition. Sarah had thought those days were over. She'd been naive. "My family has been in this county for 4 generations, Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite the fury building inside her. We've farmed this land, paid taxes on it, and contributed to this community longer than you're precious. Development has even existed. You don't get to tell me I don't belong here." Margaret laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Belonging isn't about how long you've been somewhere, dear. It's about fitting in, and you clearly don't." One of the contractors approached them, a middle-aged man with kind eyes who looked uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Mrs. Whitfield, ma'am, we're ready to start whenever you give the word." Margaret checked her gold watch. "Excellent timing, Frank. Miss Chen, this is your last chance to do this the easy way. Remove your animals and tear down the barn yourself. And I might be persuaded to waive the fines the association will be levying for each day you've been in violation." "Fines?" Sarah's head was spinning. "Oh, did I forget to mention?" Margaret's smile was predatory. $50,000 per day, retroactive to the day the new zoning took effect. "By my calculations, you owe approximately $9 million. Sarah felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. $9 million. She made maybe $30,000 a year working part-time at the veterinary clinic while caring for her animals. She could work for 300 years and never come close to that amount. "This is insane," she whispered. "This is justice," Margaret corrected. "This is what happens when people think they're above the rules that the rest of us have to follow." Frank the contractor shifted uncomfortably. "Mrs. Whitfield, are you sure about the demolition? This barn looks like it's been here a real long time. Might be some historical significance." "Right." Margaret's voice could have frozen water. "You're being paid to operate equipment, not to think. Are we clear?" Frank's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Sarah looked around desperately. The other contractors and surveyors were studiously avoiding eye contact. These were good men, working men, who probably had families to feed and mortgages to pay. They couldn't afford to cross someone like Margaret Whitfield any more than Sarah could. But as she watched Margaret signal to Frank and heard the bulldozer's engine roar louder, something crystallized inside her. This wasn't just about a barn, or even about her animals. This was about everything her family had fought for. Everything. They'd built everything they'd sacrificed to create a life in this place. "Stop," Sarah said quietly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "I'm sorry. I said stop." Sarah's voice was stronger now. "Don't touch my barn." Margaret's laugh was genuinely amused this time. "And exactly how do you plan to stop me? Are you going to throw yourself in front of the bulldozer? How very dramatic." Sarah looked at the woman who was trying to destroy her life, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she smiled. "No, Mrs. Whitfield, I'm going to stop you the same way you're trying to destroy me, with paperwork." She pulled out her cell phone and dialed a number she'd memorized years ago, but never thought she'd need. "Jim, it's Sarah Chen, remember that favor you said you owed my grandfather?" "Yes, the one from the war. I need to call it in, right now." Margaret's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Who are you calling?" Sarah kept the phone pressed to her ear, but her eyes never left Margaret's face. "Someone who's going to be very interested in your little demolition project. You see, Mrs. Whitfield, you made one crucial mistake." "And what's that?" "You assumed I didn't know how to fight back." Margaret's face went pale, but she quickly recovered her composure. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but Mrs. Whitfield," Frank the contractor called out, "we've got a problem." Margaret spun around. "What kind of problem?" Frank was staring at his phone, his face grim. "Just got a call from my supervisor. Says we." Jim Morrison stepped out of his sedan with the measured authority of a man who'd spent 40% years navigating government bureaucracy. At 73, he still carried himself like the Marine sergeant he'd been in Vietnam, his silver hair cropped short and his weathered face set in grim determination. Behind him, two younger officials emerged from their vehicles, their arms full of folders and legal documents. Margaret Whitfield watched them approach with the expression of someone witnessing her own execution. She'd built her reputation on knowing every rule, every loophole, every angle that could be exploited to get her way. The idea that she'd been outmaneuvered by someone she considered beneath her was incomprehensible. "Sarah, honey," Jim called out, his voice carrying the warmth reserved for family. "Sorry I couldn't get here sooner. Had to pull some strings to get the emergency injunction filed this fast." Margaret found her voice. "Emergency injunction? On what grounds?" Jim's eyes settled on her with the kind of cold assessment that had once evaluated enemy positions. "And you are?" "Margaret Whitfield, president of the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I demand to know by what authority you're interfering with a legally sanctioned demolition." "Legally sanctioned?" Jim's eyebrows rose. "Ma'am, I've been doing this job for 30 years, and I've never seen a demolition order quite this, creative." One of the younger officials, a woman in her 30s with bright red hair and sharp green eyes, stepped forward. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the county clerk's office, Mrs. Whitfield. Are you aware that this property is currently under review for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places?" Margaret's face went ashen. "That's impossible." "I would have been notified you would have been," Jennifer agreed, "if you'd bothered to check the public records before filing your demolition request. The application was submitted 6 months ago and has been pending approval ever since." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward her grandfather's foresight. Even 20 years after his death, Robert Chen was still protecting his family. She remembered finding the paperwork in his desk drawer, after the funeral dozens of carefully preserved documents, applications, and photographs he'd submitted to various historical societies over the years. She'd filed the National Register application on a whim, never imagining it would become her salvation. Furthermore, Jennifer continued, pulling out a thick folder, your HOA's demolition order violates at least 6 different county ordinances, 3 state historical preservation laws, and my personal favorite, the Federal Archaeological Resources Protection Act. Archaeological, Margaret sputtered. This is a barn, not some ancient burial ground. The third official, a quiet man in his 50s wearing a State Historical Society badge, cleared his throat. Actually, Mrs. Whitfield, preliminary surveys indicate this property may contain artifacts from the original Cherokee settlement that predated European colonization by several centuries. Any disturbance of the land requires extensive archaeological review. Margaret looked like she'd been slapped. Cherokee settlement? That's ridiculous. There were never any Indians here. Native Americans, Sarah corrected quietly. And yes, there were. My grandfather used to find arrowheads and pottery shards when he plowed the back 40. He always said this land had been sacred long before we got here. Jim nodded approvingly. Robert was a smart man. He knew the value of respecting what came before. He turned to Margaret, his expression hardening. Which brings us to the real issue here, Mrs. Whitfield. See, I've been looking into your HOAS activities over the past few years, and I've found some interesting patterns. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her scattered papers. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything, ma'am. I'm stating facts. Jim pulled out his own folder, thick with official documents. In the past 5 years, your HOA has filed demolition orders against 7 different properties. All 7 happen to be owned by minority families. All 7 were forced to sell their land at below-market prices to developers who just happened to have connections to your husband's construction company. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Frank the contractor had shut off his bulldozer engine and was listening intently. The other workers exchanged glances, and Sarah could see the pieces clicking together in their minds. Margaret's composure finally cracked. That's a complete coincidence. Those properties were legitimate violations, were they? Jennifer Walsh opened her own file. Because I've got the original inspection reports right here, and they tell a very different story. Take the Morales family farm on Cedar Ridge Road. Your HOA cited them for unsanitary livestock conditions. But the county health department had inspected the same property just 3 weeks earlier and found no violations whatsoever. Or the Washington family's century-old church, Jim added, suddenly declared a fire hazard despite having passed its safety inspection with flying colors just months before. Sarah felt sick as the full scope of Margaret's scheme became clear. You've been systematically targeting families, forcing them out for profit, Jennifer finished. Every single one of those properties was sold to Whitfield Development Corporation within 6 months of the forced demolition. They were then subdivided and turned into luxury housing developments. Margaret's face cycled through a range of emotions: fear, anger, desperation, and finally, a cold fury that made her look genuinely dangerous. You can't prove any of this. It's all circumstantial, actually, Jim interrupted. We can prove it. See, your husband wasn't quite as careful with his paperwork as you were with yours. We found the contracts, Mrs. Whitfield, pre-signed purchase agreements dated weeks before the demolition orders were even filed, email chains discussing problem properties, and how to expedite their resolution, bank records showing payments to certain county officials, who might have been willing to expedite zoning changes for the right price. Margaret took a step backward, her face now completely drained of color. Robert would never. He's a respected businessman, ... Double quotes was, Jim corrected gently. Past tense. See, your husband was picked up about an hour ago on federal racketeering charges, something about conspiracy to commit mail fraud, bribery of public officials, and violation of the Fair Housing Act. The FBI's been building this case for 2 years. Sarah watched Margaret Whitfield's world collapse in real time. The woman who had stood so confidently just an hour earlier, ready to destroy everything Sarah held dear, now looked like she was about to faint. That's impossible, Margaret whispered. Robert's in Chicago on business. He has meetings all week. Jim pulled out his phone and showed her the screen. It displayed a news article with a photograph of a handcuffed man in an expensive suit, being led away from a downtown office building. The headline read, Local developer arrested in multi-million-dollar housing fraud scheme. Margaret stared at the photo for a long moment, then let out a sound that was part sob, part scream. No, this can't be happening. We were so careful, ... You were careful about covering your tracks, Jennifer agreed. But you weren't careful about who you chose to victimize. When you went after Sarah's property, you made a crucial mistake. What mistake? Margaret's voice was barely audible. Sarah stepped forward, and for the first time since this ordeal began, she smiled. You assumed I was powerless. You saw a young Asian woman living alone on a farm and figured I'd be easy to intimidate. But you didn't do your homework, Mrs. Whitfield. My grandfather didn't just build this barn, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger. He built relationships, friendships, trust. When he came back from the war, people in this community looked out for him because he'd looked out for them. Jim here, Grandpa saved his life in Kisan, Jennifer's grandfather. Grandpa gave him his first job when no one else would hire an Irish immigrant. Margaret looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route that didn't exist. See, Sarah said, you've spent years building walls to keep people out. My grandfather spent his life building bridges to bring people together. And today, Mrs. Whitfield, you found out which approach builds a stronger foundation. Jim stepped closer to Margaret, his voice taking on an official tone. Margaret Whitfield, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, violation of federal housing laws, and abuse of public office. You have the right to remain silent. As Jim continued reading the Miranda rights, Margaret's legs gave out. She sank to her knees in the mud, her cream-colored blazer staining brown, her perfect hair falling loose from its pins. The woman, who had wielded power like a weapon just hours earlier, was now just another criminal facing justice. Frank, the contractor, approached Sarah hesitantly. Ma'am, I just want you to know, we never would have gone through with it if we'd known what was really going on. Some of us suspected something wasn't right, but we needed the work. ... double quotes. Sarah nodded understanding. I know, Frank, you were just doing your job. What happens now? He asked. Jennifer Walsh answered as she helped load Margaret into the back of Jim's sedan. Now Miss Chen's property is officially protected as a historically significant site. The HOA's authority over this land is null and void, and any attempt to interfere with the operation of this farm will result in federal charges. As the OF 3 days after Margaret Whitfield's arrest, Sarah thought the nightmare was over. The national news had picked up the story of the corrupt HOA president and her husband's housing fraud scheme. Reporters called it the largest systematic housing discrimination case in the region's history. Sarah had given interviews to local stations, posing next to her century-old barn while explaining how her grandfather's foresight had saved her family's legacy. She should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt like she was being watched. It started with small things. Her mail delivery stopped arriving on time. Phone calls where no one spoke when she answered. Trucks driving slowly past her property. At odd hours, their drivers' faces hidden behind tinted windows. At first, Sarah told herself she was being paranoid. Margaret was in jail awaiting trial, and her husband Robert was facing federal charges. The threat was over. Then her animals started getting sick. It began with Buttercup, her oldest mare. The gentle Palomino, who had been rescued from a neglect case 3 years earlier, suddenly refused to eat. When Sarah found her lying down in her stall, barely responsive, she immediately called Dr. Martinez from the emergency veterinary clinic. I've never seen anything like this, Dr. Martinez muttered as he examined blood samples under his portable microscope. Her white blood cell count is through the roof, but I can't identify what's causing the immune response. By evening, 2 more horses showed similar symptoms. Then the cows? Sarah paced her kitchen floor at midnight, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke with every veterinarian within a 50-mile radius. None of them had answers. Sarah, you need to consider the possibility that this isn't natural, Dr. Martinez said during his 3rd visit in 2 days. The symptoms are consistent with some kind of toxic exposure, but I can't find any environmental cause. Toxic exposure. Sarah's blood ran cold. You mean someone poisoned them? I can't prove it without more extensive testing, but ... He hesitated, then lowered his voice. I've been practicing veterinary medicine for 25 years. I've never seen 6 different animals from the same property develop identical symptoms simultaneously. This feels deliberate. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat on her front porch with her grandfather's old hunting rifle across her knees, watching the shadows between the trees. Every rustling branch, every night sound made her heart race. When dawn finally broke, she was exhausted but more determined than ever. She was feeding the recovering animals when Jim Morrison's sedan pulled up her driveway. But this time, he wasn't alone. A woman in a black suit stepped out of the passenger side, her sharp eyes scanning the property with professional assessment. Sarah, this is Agent Rebecca Torres from the FBI, Jim said without preamble. We need to talk. Agent Torres was younger than Sarah had expected, maybe 35, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of alert posture that suggested she was ready for trouble. She shook Sarah's hand with a firm grip, her eyes never stopping, their constant surveillance of the surroundings. Ms. Chen, we have reason to believe you may be in danger, Torres said directly. Margaret Whitfield's arrest has triggered some unexpected reactions from people we didn't know were involved in her operation. Sarah led them into her kitchen, pouring coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Someone's been poisoning my animals. Torres nodded grimly. We suspected as much. The toxicology reports we had run on similar cases showed traces of a compound that's not commercially available. Someone with access to industrial chemicals is targeting the properties that were supposed to be acquired through the Whitfield scheme. Other properties. Sarah set down her mug harder than intended. You mean this is happening to other people? Jim pulled out a folder. The Martinez family from Cedar Ridge Road. Their chickens all died 2 nights ago. The Washingtons had their well water contaminated with something that made their entire family sick. The Jackson farm lost 30 head of cattle to what the veterinarians are calling unknown toxins. Sarah felt sick. These are the families who were forced out before the ones who fought back, Torres corrected. The ones who filed complaints, hired lawyers, or tried to resist the demolition orders. Someone is systematically targeting them. But why now? Margaret and Robert are both in custody. Torres exchanged a look with Jim. Because Margaret and Robert were just the local operation, we've discovered that Whitfield Development Corporation was part of a much larger network. They call themselves the Heritage Foundation, and they've been operating in 12 states, using similar tactics to acquire land for development. Sarah's coffee grew cold as Torres explained the scope of the conspiracy. The Heritage Foundation was a shadow organization of wealthy developers, corrupt politicians, and white supremacist groups working together to systematically displace minority communities from valuable land. They used local proxies like Margaret Whitfield to do the dirty work, then swooped in through shell companies to purchase the properties at below-market prices. Margaret's arrest exposed their entire regional operation, Torres continued. Now they're in damage control mode, trying to eliminate anyone who might testify against them or expose their methods. Eliminate. Sarah's voice came out as a whisper. The Martinez family received death threats and moved to California last week. The Washingtons' house was burned down while they were at church, officially ruled an electrical fire. But we know better. You're the most visible target, Ms. Chen. Your story's been all over the news. They see you as a threat to their entire operation. Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the barn where her grandfather had taught her to ride, where she'd cried when her grandmother died, where she'd decided to dedicate her life to caring for abandoned animals. So what do I do? Ron, let them win. We want you to help us catch them, Torres said quietly. Sarah turned around. What? Jim leaned forward. Sarah, you're the only victim who successfully fought back and won. Your case is the foundation for everything we're building against them. But more than that, we think they're going to make a move against you soon, and when they do, we want to be ready. Torres opened her briefcase and pulled out what looked like a small electronic device. This is a surveillance system. We want to place cameras and recording equipment around your property. When they come in, they will come while have everything. We need to roll up the entire network. You want to use me as bait? We want to give you the chance to finish what your grandfather started, Jim said gently. Robert Chen didn't just fight for his own family's right to belong here. He fought for everyone's right to belong. This is bigger than your farm, Sarah. This is about whether people like the Heritage Foundation get to decide who belongs in America. Sarah looked out at her animals, most of them rescues who had nowhere else to go. Buttercup was standing now, though still weak. The mare looked up at the house as if sensing Sarah's gaze, and their eyes met through the glass. What exactly are you asking me to do? Torres smiled for the first time since arriving. Keep living your life. Keep taking care of your animals. Keep being visible and defiant. But when they come for you, we'll be watching. And if something goes wrong, then we'll have 20 federal agents positioned around your property, armed with enough firepower to level a small building. Torres replied, These people are dangerous, Miss Chen, but they're also predictable. They've been getting away with intimidation and violence for so long that they've gotten sloppy. Your grandfather taught you how to defend what's yours. Now we're going to teach you how to fight back. That evening, as FBI technicians installed invisible cameras throughout her property, Sarah called the local news station that had interviewed her earlier in the week. This is Sarah Chen, she said when the reporter answered. I want to make a statement. About Margaret Whitfield, about what happened to my farm, and about what's still happening to other families. Can you be here tomorrow morning? Of course. What kind of statement? Sarah looked out at her barn, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. I want to tell them that I'm not backing down, that this farm isn't going anywhere, and that anyone who thinks they can scare me away has seriously underestimated what it means to be Robert Chen's granddaughter. As she hung up the phone, Sarah didn't notice the dark sedan parked on the hill overlooking her property, or the man inside speaking quietly into a radio. She didn't see him start his engine and drive away as darkness fell. But Agent Torres, monitoring the surveillance feeds from a van hidden in the woods, saw everything. She keyed her radio with grim satisfaction. Control. This is Torres. The package is in place. Looks like our friends took the bait. All units, prepare for contact. This ends tomorrow. The news crew arrived at Sarah's farm at dawn, their van kicking up dust as it rolled down the gravel driveway. Sarah had barely slept, spending the night checking on her recovering animals and trying to ignore the invisible army of federal agents hidden throughout her property. Agent Torres had assured her they were there, but the illusion of being alone was so complete that Sarah sometimes wondered if she'd imagined the entire conversation. Reporter Michelle Kim stepped out of the van, with her cameraman in tow. both of them professional but clearly energized by the story's national implications. The Heritage Foundation scandal was exploding across social media, with hashtag Justice for Sarah trending and dozens of other victims coming forward with similar stories. Ms. Chen, thank you for agreeing to this follow-up interview, Michelle said, adjusting her microphone as the cameraman set up his equipment. Our viewers are fascinated by your story, but we understand there have been some troubling developments since Margaret Whitfield's arrest. Sarah nodded, positioning herself in front of the barn where everything had started just a week earlier. She'd chosen this spot deliberately. It was where Torres had told her the confrontation would most likely occur, giving the hidden agents the best vantage points. Michelle, what people need to understand is that Margaret Whitfield wasn't acting alone, Sarah began, looking directly into the camera. She was part of a much larger conspiracy to steal land from minority families across the country. And even though she's been arrested, the people behind her are still out there, still threatening families like mine. Are you saying you're currently under threat? I'm saying that standing up to bullies sometimes makes you a target for bigger bullies. Sarah's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly. But I learned something from my grandfather that these people don't understand. Sometimes the right thing to do is also the hardest thing to do. And sometimes you have to fight not just for yourself, but for everyone who can't fight back. As if on cue, Buttercup emerged from the barn, her palomino coat gleaming in the morning sun. The mare had recovered remarkably well from the poisoning, and her presence beside Sarah created a perfect visual metaphor for resilience and survival. What would you say to the people behind the Heritage Foundation if you could speak to them directly? Michelle asked. Sarah looked straight into the camera, her voice carrying the authority of 4 generations of her family's determination. I'd say that you picked the wrong family to mess with. My grandfather didn't fight in Vietnam just to come home and watch his granddaughter be intimidated by cowards who hide behind fake organizations and poison innocent animals. This farm has survived the Great Depression, 2 floods, a tornado, and now your pathetic attempts at terrorism. We're not going anywhere. The cameraman was getting excellent footage, moving around to capture different angles of Sarah with the barn in the background. Neither he nor Michelle noticed the black SUV that had appeared at the end of the driveway, or the way it had stopped just out of sight behind a grove of trees. But Sarah noticed, and in her earpiece, so small that the camera couldn't detect it, she heard Agent Torres's voice. Contact. 3 vehicles, approximately 12 individuals. Sarah, keep doing exactly what you're doing. Don't look toward the tree line. Sarah's heart rate spiked, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact with the camera. The Heritage Foundation thinks they can scare people into giving up their homes, their history, their right to belong in their own communities. But they're about to learn that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. And what are those things? Michonne prompted, completely unaware of the drama unfolding around them. Family, community, justice. The belief that in America, right should triumph over might. The idea that a person's worth isn't determined by the color of their skin or the size of their bank account. Sarah's voice grew stronger with each word. My grandfather taught me that you don't measure a person by how they treat those who can help them, but by how they treat those who can't fight back. And these people have been preying on families who they thought couldn't fight back for far too long. Through her earpiece, she heard Torres again. They're moving. 6 individuals approaching from the north, 4 from the south, 2 staying with the vehicles. Sarah, when I say the word now, I want you and the news crew to drop to the ground immediately. Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly, then continued speaking to the camera. I want every family that's been victimized by these people to know that they're not alone. I want every community that's been targeted to know that there are people fighting for them. And I want the cowards behind the Heritage Foundation to know that their reign of terror ends today. The first gunshot shattered the morning quiet. Michelle Kim screamed and dropped her microphone as her cameraman instinctively kept rolling, his professional instincts overriding his fear. Sarah grabbed Michelle's arm and pulled her behind the solid oak fence post, just as Torres's voice exploded in her earpiece. Now, get down now. The world erupted into chaos. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions as black-clad figures emerged from the tree line, assault rifles raised. But they had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. FBI agents materialized from positions Sarah hadn't even known existed behind hay bales. In the barn loft, even inside her own house, federal agents, drop your weapons. Torres's voice boomed through a megaphone, but the Heritage Foundation operatives had come prepared for war, not surrender. Sarah pressed herself against the fence, shielding Michelle with her body as bullets splintered the wood above their heads. The cameraman had taken cover behind his van, but was still filming, capturing footage that would later be used as evidence in dozens of federal prosecutions. Through the gunfire, Sarah could hear Torres coordinating the response. Alpha Team, subjects are flanking east. Bravo Team, watch your crossfire. Charlie Team, move to intercept the vehicles. One of the gunmen broke from cover, running directly toward Sarah's position with his weapon raised. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought the FBI response had failed, that she was about to pay the ultimate price for her defiance. But Buttercup, startled by the noise and chaos, reared up between Sarah and the approaching gunman. The man hesitated for just a split second, unwilling to shoot the horse, and that hesitation cost him everything. Agent Torres appeared behind him like an avenging angel, her service weapon pressed against the base of his skull. "Game over," she said quietly. The firefight lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the shooting finally stopped, 12 Heritage Foundation operatives were in custody, including 2 men Sarah recognized from photos Torres had shown her regional coordinators, who had been orchestrating similar operations across 3 states. As paramedics checked Sarah and the news crew for injuries, Torres approached with a grim smile. "Ms. Chen, I want you to know that what you did here today just brought down the largest domestic terrorism network we've encountered in 20 years. The footage your cameraman got, combined with the evidence we've gathered from these arrests, is going to put these people away for life." Sarah looked around at her property, now swarming with federal agents and crime scene technicians. "Is it over the immediate threat?" "Yes, the Heritage Foundation. We've got enough evidence to dismantle their entire operation, but the bigger fight, the fight for the kind of community your grandfather believed in, that's never really over." Michelle Kim, shaken but determined to finish her story, approached with her microphone. "Ms. Chen, after everything that's happened, after being shot at and threatened, do you have any regrets about fighting back?" Sarah looked at her barn, still standing strong, after a century of storms. She looked at Buttercup, who had quite literally stood between her and danger. She thought about her grandfather, who had faced down much worse than domestic terrorists, and had never backed down from doing what was right. "Only one regret," Sarah said finally. "I regret that my grandfather isn't here to see this. He always said that America was a place where ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they had to." Today proved him right. As the news van drove away with the story that would dominate headlines for weeks, Sarah stood alone in her barnyard for the first time in days. The FBI agents were packing up their equipment, the crime scene tape was being removed, and life was slowly returning to normal. But normal would never quite be the same. Within a week, Sarah's story had inspired legislation strengthening protections for rural landowners. The families who had been displaced by the Heritage Foundation's schemes were offered federal assistance to reclaim their properties. Margaret Whitfield, faced with overwhelming evidence and the promise of a reduced sentence, provided testimony that led to arrests in 11 states. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she'd faced down Margaret Whitfield's bulldozer, but this time, she wasn't alone. Representatives from the National Register of Historic Places were presenting her with the official designation for her property. Jim Morrison was there, along with Agent Torres, who had become an unlikely friend. The families who had been displaced were returning, and the community that had been fractured by greed and hatred was slowly healing.